Greetings, salutations, and welcome to the KreegerCast. I'm your host, Patrick Kreeger, and I'm joined today by my father, Wit Kreeger.
Yes, and I'm Wit Kreeger, and I'm so happy to join my son this evening and just kind of chat.
Well, there was a particular topic you wanted to talk about.
Definitely. What I wanted to talk about is how it came to pass that I worked about 5 years at US Steel. So,
And US Steel was what?
well, US Steel is a steel company, probably one of the oldest in the country, actually.
I think it was the first.
Could be, because it was part of the old Carnegie Works.
Yeah.
And this happened to be Southworks, where I got my first job right out of college. Excuse me. I seem to have a frog in my speech. Well, anyway, I think to really start this, I would like to give you an idea of the time when I graduated from college. It was 1962. And so the 50s had kind of come to an end, and people were talking about the hippies. There was a rumor of a Vietnam War about to begin, that kind of thing. It was exciting to be out of college. I graduated as a mechanical engineer, and US Steel at that time really snapped up engineers. To give you an idea what a big deal it was to graduate as a mechanical engineer at the time, for the most part, you could come right out of college and make more money than your parents did. Unless your parents were extremely wealthy. In my case, my starting salary at US Steel was $553 a month. I remember that. I don't know. That's kind of weird, but and it was nearly $100 more than what my dad made at the time. He made 400 and something.
And I was working at Caterpillar still, or?
And that was, my dad worked at near Keystone Steel and Wire at Laidlaw.
Oh, okay, this was the Laidlaw days.
Yeah. So anyway, he was able to support a family of 5 children, 7 people, reasonably comfortably. He sent me to college, so it was a good life. We had a house. So I started out with more money than I was ever used to receiving. We got paid once a month, and it was a big deal. And I can't remember what the net pay was, but it was probably still around $400 or so, So at that time, if you needed an apartment, you could get one for $80 a month.
That's not bad compared to the amount of money you're making.
Yeah. But I digress a bit. So you have a sense of what it was like, approximately, 56 years ago or so. It was a different time. America was a whole different place than it is today. We had Republicans and Democrats and all that, but we didn't really have the goings-on that you see today.
We do try not to be political on this podcast.
So, okay, feel free to edit all the political stuff out, but it was an exciting time. And I guess I should tell you, how I chose US Steel, because I had several offers for a job. And at that time, the space program was also picking up. And actually, if I wanted to make another $100 a month or so, I could have taken one of the offers from California, and Boeing was, you just had to say, hey, I want to go and work as an engineer at Boeing. they paid around $600 a month, so it. But word got back from people that went to Boeing, from the class before me, and they had. They said they were sitting there, for months, twiddling their thumbs because in order to get a government contract, evidently Boeing had to show a staff of engineers that they're ready and willing to do whatever the government, required in terms of design and so forth, technical abilities. And so they just hired just about any engineer that came out of college. And, if you wanted a job, you pretty much could have one, So anyway, US Steel. I started to go on interviews, with several companies. I interviewed Republic Steel, and there were some other companies. There was a bearing company that I also interviewed with, and I can't recall their name right now. But it was basically recruiters came to college, and they made their spiel. And then we talked to some of the people that went with them, see
if the promises were true.
Yeah, and for the most part, but for the space program, things were fairly positive. Chicago in itself was really an industrial hub. And so jobs in manufacturing were plentiful. I remember my father when he, because he was kind of low on a totem pole, at Caterpillar at the time. When he got laid off, he'd go to Chicago and get a job from Peoria. That meant that he had to stay there because it was, 150 miles or so to Chicago, and he had to stay there. So the steel mill was really kind of a dirty place. It was loud. I remember Republic Steel and Inland Steel, it was loud. The floors were dirt floor, machinery. But when I came to US Steel South Works, I found something special. They happened to have had there at the time what they called a blooming mill. And I was there with other visitors, other students, and prospective employees that for the management ranks, that they interviewed, and showed off their stuff. And what I saw was the blooming mill, and I saw these massive, 20-ton plus ingots, of steel being shoved through a rolling mill. And what I remember distinctly, there was this rolling mill, I had a motor sitting on the side, big electric motors, and shafts would go to the rolls. They were about 3 foot in diameter and perhaps 50 feet long, solid steel. And I saw these things, reversing like instantly. And I knew, being an engineer, how massive that was and what kind of power it takes to reverse a shaft, and push these ingots through to make them into something manageable that could be processed down the line. And I saw these reversing shafts and the sparks flying and everything, and I said to myself, yeah, this is where I want to work, So I accepted their offer as a management intern. That's what you did. That's what you did. They called it a management intern. And so I was the management interns. There were about 10 or 12 of us at the time. And we had an office, and we had somebody that was in charge of us, that kind of cared for us. We had We had a secretary, somebody to answer the phone and take messages for us. And we had a typist. At that time, you had everything was done by hand. The thing that was missing in our office was air conditioning.
I didn't think air conditioning was much of a thing in the early 60s.
Probably not. It was around here and there, but so the office, you got to picture this. We would sit in the office, and they gave us literature and stuff to read. In the first few days, and so we had to kind of understand terms in a steel mill, but we were right next to a place called a sintering plant, and the sintering plant was a place where they took iron fines. I'm going to use a lot of terms here and just kind of have to
roll with it
because I can't explain everything in just a very short time. So the sinter plant would basically take iron fines, and there's a clear definition for that, and agglomerate these iron fines into something that can be charged into a blast furnace, to make steel. So basically, this whole plant was there to take stuff that you couldn't put directly into a blast furnace and make it into something, kind of like briquettes, but not really briquettes. It was weird looking stuff, It was like, have you ever taken lead and throw it in water?
No, but I'm familiar with what that looks like.
Yeah, like that.
In the jewelry industry, it's just called shot.
Yeah, so it kind of goes,
Yeah.
It's kind of flows and that. Okay, so the stuff coming out of there was kind of like that. Well, this was a facility that was 99% dust free. Okay, they were really proud of this, but I tell you what, that 1% really raised hell. Okay, that 1%, when it drifted into the open windows, because we had to have windows and fans and stuff like this. So imagine, you're working on something, a report that you handwrite because somebody's going to type it for you, and you're sweating. Okay, so you put your arm down and the paper sticks to your arms, okay, because you're sweating. It's really, Chicago is like 98% humidity and 98 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's kind of like this, so it's almost at the edge of raining, like all the time, plus the dust. So every day there was like this layer of dust when you came in the morning, and as soon as you put your hand down, it was red, Oh, God.
From the iron rust
From the
dust.
iron ore, yeah. Anyway, so as a management intern, we were sent to all of the different departments of the steel mill. That was a 2-year process, actually. It's like a management apprenticeship.
Yeah. Well, an internship.
So we actually attended high-level meetings and all this kind of stuff. But so we were sent to different departments, and at the end of those 2 years, if you didn't have a job offer from one of those departments, you were fired. So of course we knew all this, and so from our starting group, probably almost half of the people didn't get any jobs,
Wow.
But I was one of the lucky ones, I got a job at in the what they call the main machine shop. My first job there was engineer of operating practice.
Okay.
Yeah, of operating practice. Yeah, so
What does that mean?
well, actually, I can't really tell you exactly what it means, but what it meant was is you would, what it meant to me is I would go and meet in the morning with the superintendent of the shop, and then and all of his immediate reports, like the assistant superintendents and general foreman and anybody that was, in first and second level management, including then me. Of course, I didn't have a management position as such, but it was a engineer of operating practices, which was a staff position of sorts, And then, he would point at me and say, and Kreeger, I want you to take care of that. And that's how I took care of that, But what was part of our responsibility as management interns, was to, when we finished our visitation, our number of weeks in each department, we had to write a report, of what we've learned. And so ultimately we had a book, that was quite thick, of all the reports that we did. And in fact, I still have that. I still have that somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where. But one of these days you can do an archaeological dig and maybe find it. I don't know. So, engineer operating practice. And I spent about maybe 6-8 months at that. In the meantime, you have to also understand that we got more money, So pretty soon, I could afford a car, and, I just bought a Corvair, 1963 Corvair, and all that. It was fun. Had a girlfriend, and life was good. Chicago was a fun place, a lot of jazz clubs and things at that time. You could, in Chicago at the time, in the 60s, especially in the early 60s, you could go just about anywhere. There were our dangerous areas, but you could, and maybe you wouldn't go there in the middle of the night, although my friends and I did, because there were some jazz clubs, that we wanted to see. There were places, I remember one was the Blue Note was one of them. And another one was called the Tender Trap. Oh yeah, Tender Trap. Now you have to remember, that I was 22 years old at the time, so I had no fear of anything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's not like today where basically no one wants to go to Chicago, period.
Yeah, that's about right. Chicago is not a great place to visit, and that's as political as I'll get. Okay,
That's fine.
But anyway, so it was a fun time. So ultimately, my 5 years at US Steel ended when I accepted a job at Kaiser Steel here in Fontana in California, and so I came. I guess it was even more than 5 years. It was practically 6 years, because in 1968 I took a job with Kaiser Steel, and so that would make it about somewhere around 6 years, that I was at US Steel. And it was there are a lot of details and anecdotes and things, that I could probably relate, but
it's kind of the point of this thing, is for you to do that.
Yeah, I suppose. Retirement parties, at US Steel were really something. One time, I was in the open hearth department, and so they invited me to a retirement party. And the retirement party was in a place called Hegwisch, which is a predominantly Polish area. You have to kind of understand that the steel mills, had their immigrant waves, so to speak. I think the British wave was probably the first, so there was really kind of a hierarchy. And then there was Scottish and Irish. And these people were still there, the Scots and Irish, okay? But the predominant immigrant wave were the Poles. Kwiatkowski, Kamiński, all these ski names, and they were running things, so they were really, they were the big kahunas there. So the Open Hearth decided to have a retirement party. I guess their superintendent retired, and so was in Hagwish. And I get there, and there was, there was everybody that I've run into was there. We had a really good time. A lot of polka music. I learned how to polka dance, all this kind of stuff. It was wonderful. And pierogies, big vats full of pierogies, that they were cooking and things like that. And and all the booze was free, So being young, with my friends there and the people that were invited and people I met, we really got hammered, and not just us, but everybody, okay? So I left somewhere around, 2 o'clock, but the party was still 2 a.m. Party was still going because I had to actually go back to work the next day, So I left. And, more than once, I would go home, take a shower, and then I had to go to work. I never really slept it. Yeah. Can kind of... I remember one time, lining up my crew in the morning after one of those things, and those parties were kind of frequent. One of those parties, and I remember saying to the crew, okay, excuse me a moment. And I went right next door to the toilet and really heaved my guts, and threw up. And so I come back, they were all kind of snickering, and they said, "Feel better, huh?" I said, "Yeah." And everybody sent them off to work. And anyway, but the reason I brought up this Open Hearth retirement party is because, I went back to work, right? And in the morning, they did not have a crew to fill the Open Hearth. And the reason they did not have a full crew in the Open Hearth because they were in jail.
Oh, so it wasn't even that they were too drunk.
No, they were in jail. I don't know what the hell they did. And so, we sent people from plant protection and high-level politicians and so forth, to bail them out. Because, we couldn't hold the crew. What you did is these things were running 24 hours, okay? So if the crew didn't show up, the crew that was there, you had to keep.
Yeah.
And you could only keep them so long before they dropped dead on you. you know? Anyway. So they had to get them out of jail, to come to work. So that was, that only happened once, So... Yeah, and the steel mill, imagine an environment, that the only thing I could kind of compare it to some of the areas is maybe what I later on read in Dante's Inferno, sparks flying. And... for instance, in the Open Hearth, we had to wear woolen clothes, because they,
the synthetics would melt.
The synthetics would melt, and the hard hats that we wore, we had our name in the front of the hard hat, but after looking into the furnace a few times, the tag would melt off. Oh Jesus, so it was.
This doesn't sound like the safest environment.
It wasn't, talking about safety, Southworks. Southworks is actually quite famous because there was a book written about Southworks, and I think it was called The Butcher Shop or something like that, because so many people died in the steel plant all the time. And so many, by many meaning, is while I was there, we probably had an order of 5 to 10 fatalities every year.
That's just amazing.
Every year.
To put that in perspective, the US steel industry for 2017, I don't think had a single fatality, or it was 3 fatalities.
Yeah, to me, this is totally foreign, because even when I came to Kaiser Steel, we celebrated when we did not have a fatality that year. We all got coffee cups and badges and all kinds of stuff, you know. So, and back at US Steel, fatalities were, you know, if we were under 10, it was a good year. So
That's,
you can probably Google all that as as a fact checker, because those statistics got to be around. But anyway, what Southworks was famous for is the slogan "Safety First" was actually invented at Southworks. Because ultimately, people that had enough, they would send their husbands to go and work there, and they wouldn't come back, By the time I was working there, it was already relatively safe.
so in 1898, the average fatality rate was 9% per year.
Holy crap.
Yeah.
We had thousands of people working there,
Yeah. And apparently in 2014, we had 150. 150 steel workers died.
Yeah. Well, and the statistics are kind of interesting. It's not like 10 people died at once because of one incident. No, it was a lot of people fell from high places. That was probably the biggest one, the biggest reason of fatalities. Falling off a crane.
It's 0.7 fatalities per million man hours currently.
That's still quite a bit, isn't it?
Yeah, that's still...
Yeah. So the steel mills are still a little bit of a rough place.
They gave the one steel mill gave the example. We have 23 workers in our steel mill. We lost 2 of them last year.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so things have. It's still a tough place.
Yeah.
But the stories that the old timers were telling us were really something. For instance. We had a rolling mill that was called the rail mill, and the rolling mill, they had it was the people that were operating it were on 2 levels. Okay, so there was a roller, who actually operated the rolls.
Yeah.
Okay, he made sure that the steel went through there, and out came a rail, a railroad rail. And then above the guy was sitting what is called the manipulator. And the manipulator would feed the steel into the roller so that the roller could actually roll it properly. I suppose nowadays all of that is done automatically. But in any case, the manipulator, who was sitting probably about 30 feet or so higher than the roller.
Mm-hmm.
When the crane went, the overhead crane went across, he had to duck.
That's a design flaw.
It was like, he had to duck. And the equipment, for the most part, was massive. Everything was tons of weight.
Yeah.
Tons and tons of weight. We had the steel warehouse in the wintertime was terrible. The steel warehouse. That steel, if you walked into, let's say it was like 20 degrees outside or something like that, the steel warehouse would suck the heat right out of your body. It was amazing. If you walked in there, all of a sudden you could feel the heat leave your body, even though you had clothes on.
Yeah.
Because of all the steel around, it somehow
created a massive heat sink.
Yeah, well, it did. It was a massive heat thing. So what we had salamanders. Salamanders were interesting because sometimes it got really cold. I mean, Chicago around New Year's or so could have minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
You know. But anyway, so we had salamanders to heat them because there was always enough what they call dunnage, which was wood that you used to load steel on railroad cars or in trucks and so forth. Because steel was transported, by railroad car, by truck, but mostly actually by ship.
Yeah, you ship heavy things by ship. Makes sense. Especially
the
around
Great
Chicago.
Lakes. That's why we were at the Great Lakes. Yeah. But anyway, so the salamanders, you have to kind of get the salamanders thing. So these were massive fires in 50-gallon steel drums. And people would come and heat themselves by them because they had work to do. There were cranes lifting. They had to move steel around, with with overhead cranes. And so I remember being on a salamander. You warm yourself in the front. You think this is pretty good. And then you warm yourself in the back. And, you can't really, because you're getting now cold in the front again. So you stay there for a little bit longer. And pretty soon you smell something. Oh, it's your pants that are on fire because, or your jacket or something.
Yeah.
You put it out and, oh, man. Anyway, they were wonderful years, actually. But
was US Steel the one where they had just finished the Bessemer furnaces, or was
good.
that?
Hey, I'm really glad that you mentioned that because the Bessemer furnaces were really missed by the population around the steel mill because when they would blow those Bessemer furnaces, from the bottom, it would light up the sky at night. And people really loved it. I've talked to people that lived in the area, that the Bessemer furnaces were fun. Problem was, of course, they put out massive amounts of pollution.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting. When I came there in 1962, they just had rebuilt all of the Bessemer furnaces, and then they never started them up. Brand new brick. They even built new offices for the superintendent. I remember visiting with the superintendent, and he had fish tanks in the office. If you were a superintendent of a department in the steel mill, you were kind of like a demigod.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big deal because first of all, you made a lot of money and you had all the power there was to be had, to run your department.
And you're literally dealing with one of the most dangerous and valuable industries in the United States at the time, even today.
Yeah, the steel industry really is quite important. One of the things, that US Steel slogan used to be, "You're never farther than a foot away from a piece of steel." And it's amazing that, the steel industry could be brought to its knees through foreign competition like this.
Well, the U.S. steel industry still produces more tonnage now than it ever did. That's a fact. The U.S. steel industry produces more tonnage every year than it ever has.
Talking about such things, I was told at the time.
Less workers.
Yeah, at the time that I worked there, they said that the Chicago area, which included Gary Works in Indiana, and Republic and Inland Steel, also there were several other steel companies. Acme Steel, there was Acme Steel also in the area. Anyway, the Chicago area by itself, during and around World War II, even post World War II. Well, post World War II, that wouldn't have even been a competition, but that area made more steel than all of Europe combined, just the Chicago area. Chicago was a really, and I think it still is kind of an important hub for industry in America because, there were also the stockyards. The stockyards were huge. That's a really huge deal because all of the railroads, wound up in Chicago and left from Chicago and shipping, through Lake Michigan, in Chicago. So it's kind of like Frank Sinatra was singing about, that toddling town. I'm not sure what he meant by toddling, but it was really a busy place. There's all kinds of stuff happening.
So I actually need to correct myself. The U.S. steel industry was at its height in the mid-'70s, but we're at the levels we were in the '60s now. And that's raw steel production. That's not any specialty steels. It's raw steel exclusively. But we are dramatically down on pig iron.
Yeah.
We're at like 50% of what the pig iron we used to produce.
Yeah, that was pig iron. A steel mill that produces pig iron is called an integrated steel mill. And there are very few of them. Kaiser Steel used to be one. And
raw or to finished product?
Yes, that's exactly right. They have blast furnaces, and because of our environmental concerns and so forth, it was once primary. This process was called primary steel making. Actually made iron, but did not make steel. But the primary processes, they were pretty well farmed out.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
They went to places where the EPA couldn't be reaching them,
England just shut down its final raw steel or raw iron producer. I want to say 1-2 years ago. They had the last steel mill, that produced raw iron.
Yeah, when you do primary steel making, you have to make coke. You make coke, which is what we did here at Kaiser Steel, And bring iron ore in. As a matter of fact, the iron ore came by ship to US Steel, and it came from all over the world. Actually,
yeah.
It was loaded into ships and it was brought into the docks at the steel mills, and it was unloaded from there, with huge gantry cranes. So
there's a reason why there's so many ships have gone down in the Great Lakes. Hauling iron can't be the safest thing to do.
Yeah,
particularly on the Great Lakes.
Well, the Great Lakes, they can be really nasty. I mean, it's almost like being at the ocean because there's certain areas, like in Indiana or even in Chicago, where I've seen ice. Of course, it's not very salty, right?
I was going to say, are the Great Lakes fresh?
It's mostly fresh, I think.
I would imagine they have to be saltier than average.
They're probably saltier, but I tell you, I have seen ice piled up at the edge of the beaches in Indiana that were 10 feet high. From splashes and so forth.
So the answer is no. They're no more salty than any other lake.
Really?
That's what makes them special.
So much ice, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're a traditional, just normal lake.
A lake, huh?
Yeah.
Huh.
They're just huge.
Well, I actually that surprises me because I've never thought about the salt content. Although I went swimming in Lake Michigan, and come to think of it, it just felt like a lake.
Yeah. It says that it does actually, allow minerals to leave, so there's not a buildup like in the oceans.
Interesting, yeah.
So
interesting. But many of our superintendents and even lower level management people, they had ships. I know one guy was particularly proud. He had something that was like a 52-foot boat.
yeah,
and it's a pretty good size.
that's a decent sized little vessel.
Yeah, 52-foot gasoline powered ship. It's something. Yeah. So actually, sailing and boating and stuff are still probably a big deal in Chicago.
I'd imagine that.
And the lake effect is kind of interesting because it's near the lake. It was always like 10 degrees cooler.
Yeah.
So it was a little more pleasant. But I tell you, when I came to work in the mornings, and they had blown out the flumes in the open hearth, get rid of all the the excess dust and accumulation in there. It was all, thrown into the lake.
Yeah.
And the lake looked red. There's like a Red Sea out there.
So is this where they use the shotguns to get the clinkers down, or
no?
That's at the power plants. Or...
Yeah.
Okay. So that will be a discussion for later.
We'll have to do that another time. Let's see what else is interesting about the steel mills.
Well, U.S. Steel, because we haven't gone on to Kaiser. So let's
U.S. Steel. So I ultimately became a foreman in a machine shop, and so I was 23 years old. And the machinists just couldn't believe, that I would be their boss. And so I had a lot of difficulties at first, until they understood that I was actually a machinist.
Yeah, because that's what you were traditionally trained on.
Yeah. So that took a while for them to have the confidence in that I knew what I was talking about. They could actually operate and run all the machines that they ran, so it was something that, I remember one guy saying, you want to be my boss? I have a son that's older than you. I said, well, that's not my fault,
Yeah.
Yeah, and wow. So yeah, first, in the machine shop, when you became a machine shop foreman, the easiest place to start was in the lathe section, because these were the lower skilled jobs, the turning lathes. The complicated sections of a machine shop like that, and remember, machine shop, we had probably, 500-600 people working there, 3 shifts. It's a pretty large area. And so then actually, I have to say that the drill press area was probably the lowest one. And then maybe the screw machines, what we used to call the screw machines, which were the turret lathes, were the next area. And then in terms of skill required. Because the screw machines were pretty much automatic. You would make 1,000 same items.
Yeah.
So you didn't even have to know how to set the machine up. In fact, I had a guy that operated a turret lathe that had an accident, and we found out that the guy couldn't speak English. He couldn't speak English. He couldn't read English, none of that. So we tried to figure out what kind of language does he speak, and we came up that it was Lithuanian. So we got ourselves a Lithuanian, and the Lithuanian says, it sounds like Lithuanian, but it's not Lithuanian. We couldn't find out how he got hurt, He almost chopped his hand off,
And he spoke foreign.
He spoke foreign. you know. But he was a guy that kind of kept to himself, and somebody set up the machine for him, and he just operated the machine, and went home, and then came back, you know. But you know, I don't know whether we can talk about this on this particular thing, so you can edit it out.
I don't really do edit outs.
Oh crap! Okay, so here it goes. We actually had a phantom shitter.
I think I remember this.
We had a phantom shitter. There was some crazy guy that would leave human turds on shelves and all kinds of places. Oh God, you know, we never did find out who that was, and it didn't happen too often, but it happened over a period of years, you know.
Okay. I mean, I suppose that happens.
The steel mill.
Well, on that note, thank you for joining me, Dad.
You're welcome. Okay.
So until next time, dear listeners, see you out there.